The user wants a script, not a front-end component. I'll write the script directly in prose. The courtroom went absolutely silent the moment she said it. Not the silence of respect, not the hush of solemnity that typically falls over Judge Miriam Okafor's courtroom on a Tuesday morning in the fall, but a different kind of silence, the kind that precedes something irreversible, the kind that makes bailiffs straighten their spines and court reporters forget to type. Margaret Holloway Ashworth, wife of Mayor Gerald Ashworth of Delmore County, had just leaned forward in her chair, fixed her ice-blue eyes on the court-appointed Housing Authority attorney across the table, and said in a voice dripping with the particular venom of a woman who has never once been told no, "You work for us. All of you work for us, and you would do well to remember that before you waste another second of my morning." 10 seconds passed. Judge Okafor did not move. She did not blink. She simply set down her pen with the measured precision of someone who had spent 31 years on the bench and had learned that silence was sometimes the most devastating weapon in any courtroom. Then she looked up, and everything changed. Before we go any further into what happened in Courtroom 7 that morning, and trust me, you need to hear every single second of this. If you've ever believed that power and privilege should not be a get-out-of-jail-free card for the wealthy and connected, drop a comment below right now. Tell me, have you ever witnessed someone use their status to bully someone who had no means to fight back? Because what unfolded in that courtroom over the next 4 hours was one of the most extraordinary displays of judicial courage, moral reckoning, and public accountability any of those present had ever witnessed. And it all started with a housing dispute that turned out to be something far, far darker. Rosa Mendez was 43 years old. She arrived at court that morning in a burgundy blouse she had ironed the night before, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her hands folded in her lap with the composed dignity of a woman who had rehearsed being calm because she couldn't afford to fall apart. She was a home health aide. She had worked 60-hour weeks for 11 years. She had saved, scrimped, budgeted, and sacrificed to put together a down payment on a small 2-bedroom house at 14 Larkspur Lane in the quiet east side of Delmore, a house that she had signed a purchase agreement for 18 months ago through the county's Affordable Housing Opportunity Program, a program funded in part by federal grants and administered through the mayor's office. Rosa had done everything right. She had the paperwork, she had the signed agreement, she had the receipt for her initial deposit, $4,300, money she had saved over 4 years. She had the letter of approval. She had all of it in a manila folder, rubber-banded and labeled in her careful handwriting, sitting on the table in front of her like a small monument to everything she had worked for. What she did not have was the house, because 6 weeks before her scheduled move-in date, the Delmore County Housing Authority had quietly reassigned 14 Larkspur Lane to a different buyer. No notice, no refund, no explanation, just a letter that arrived on a Friday afternoon informing Rosa that the property had been reallocated due to administrative review and that her application had been placed back into the general pool. The $4,300, the letter said it would be returned within 90 business days. 90 business days. Rosa had gone to the Housing Authority office 3 times. She had called 14 times. She had written 2 formal letters. She had finally, after 4 months of being ignored, contacted a legal aid clinic, and that is what had brought her to Courtroom 7 on a Tuesday morning in October, sitting across a long oak table from Margaret Holloway Ashworth and the mayor's office's fleet of attorneys in their tailored suits, their matching briefcases, their quiet institutional confidence. Margaret had arrived 15 minutes late. She did not apologize. She wore a cream-colored blazer and carried a leather handbag that cost more than Rosa's monthly rent. She had smiled at the bailiff with the tolerance of someone acknowledging a piece of furniture, signed something her attorney slid in front of her without reading it, and then spent the first 20 minutes of the preliminary hearing scrolling on her phone beneath the table, which everyone in the room could see and no one initially said anything about. Because she was the mayor's wife, because in Delmore County, that meant something. It had meant something for a long time. That's when Rosa's attorney, a young woman named Priya Chandrasekhar from the Delmore Legal Aid Collective, 28 years old, 2 years out of law school, wearing a blazer one size too large that she had bought at a consignment shop specifically for court appearances, cleared her throat and began to speak. She laid out the timeline with extraordinary precision: the signed agreement, the deposit receipt, the approval letter, the notice of reallocation. She placed each document on the table one at a time and named the date on each one. Her voice did not shake. Judge Miriam Okafor, who had presided over Delmore County Court since before Priya was born, watched all of this from the bench with an expression that gave away nothing but absorbed everything. She was 64 years old. She had short silver hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had a reputation in Delmore County that functioned more like mythology. Lawyers who had appeared in her courtroom for decades still described her in hushed, slightly reverent tones. She had once, in a 2009 fraud case, paused mid-proceeding to ask a corporate attorney to define a word he had used in his own filing because she wanted the record to reflect that he couldn't. He couldn't. She was that kind of judge. Margaret Holloway Ashworth's lead attorney, a man named Garrison Price, interrupted Priya's timeline presentation 3 times in the first 10 minutes. Once to question the admissibility of the deposit receipt, which was a stamped official county receipt. Once to suggest the approval letter contained a procedural error, which it did not. And once, most remarkably, to suggest that Rosa's emotional investment in the property was clouding her understanding of the administrative process, at which point Judge Okafor removed her reading glasses from their chain and held them in her hand in the specific way that everyone who had ever appeared before her knew meant that something was about to happen. "Mr. Price," she said in a voice like winter, "are you suggesting that a woman who paid over $4,000 in documented county-stamped funds and received a signed letter of approval is confused about the nature of a legal contract?" The room breathed differently after that. Price adjusted his tie. "I am suggesting, Your Honor, that the administrative review process—" "Yes or no, Mr. Price?" He did not answer yes or no. He said something about regulatory frameworks, and the judge wrote something down, and Priya Chandrasekhar, across the table, did not allow herself to smile, but almost. It was at this moment that Margaret Holloway Ashworth, who had apparently decided she had been a spectator long enough, leaned forward, leveled her gaze at Priya, and said the thing that changed the temperature of the room permanently. "You work for us. All of you work for us. And you would do well to remember that before you waste another second of my morning." The room did not just go quiet. It went still, the kind of still where you can hear the fluorescent lights, where the court reporter's fingers hover over the keys without pressing them, where the bailiff by the door shifts his weight to his other foot and stares at a point 6 inches above everyone's head. Judge Okafor set down her pen. She looked at Margaret Holloway Ashworth for what witnesses later described as a very long 5 seconds. Then she said calmly, completely without theater, "Mrs. Holloway Ashworth, I want to be very precise with you right now. No one in this courtroom works for you. They work for the people of this county, which includes the woman sitting across from you. And this is the only time I will explain that distinction. Bailiff." The bailiff moved. Margaret's attorney put his hand on her arm. Margaret looked at the judge with an expression caught precisely between fury and the first intimation of fear, the look of someone who has only ever known one response to resistance and is discovering, for possibly the first time, that it has stopped working. She was escorted from the room, not in handcuffs, not in disgrace, yet, but in the particular stunned silence of someone who has walked into a wall they didn't know existed. The courtroom exhaled. And then Priya Chandrasekhar asked if she could present additional evidence. The judge said yes, and that is when the case stopped being about one house on Larkspur Lane and became something considerably larger, because Priya had not spent 4 months on this case only to bring Rosa's file. She had spent 4 months asking a very specific question. Had Rosa's situation happened to anyone else? The answer, as the next 90 minutes would reveal, was yes, 19 times. Priya presented the court with a binder, 3 inches thick, tabbed and indexed, containing documentation for 19 other applicants in the Delmore Affordable Housing Opportunity Program who had experienced near-identical patterns of reallocation, signed agreements, paid deposits, approval letters, and then within a window of 6 to 12 weeks before move-in, a letter of administrative reallocation. 19 people, 18 of them were first-generation immigrant families or households with documented lower-middle incomes. 14 of those reallocation notices had been issued within the same fiscal quarter. Priya placed the binder on the table and then placed next to it a printed spreadsheet, color-coded, which she had built from public property records. Every single property that had been reallocated had subsequently transferred, not back to the general pool, as the letters claimed, but to buyers with no prior application on record. Buyers who had appeared in the county system for the first time within 48 hours of the reallocation notice. Buyers who had, in 12 of the 19 cases, documented ties to either campaign donors of Mayor Ashworth or members of the Delmore County Planning Commission. Your Honor, Priya said, what I am presenting is a pattern that suggests systematic redirection of publicly funded affordable housing assets to politically connected private buyers with deposit funds withheld for extended periods from the original qualified applicants. The silence after that sentence was different from the silence after Margaret's outburst. That had been shocked silence. This was the silence of a room processing something enormous. This was understanding arriving all at once. Judge Okafor said nothing for a moment. She turned pages. She put on her reading glasses. She cross-referenced 2 documents. She looked up. Ms. Chandrasekhar, she said, is any of this information that has previously been before this court or any administrative body? No, Your Honor, it is not. And the deposits, all 19, were they returned within the stated 90 business days? Priya paused in the way that someone pauses when the answer is going to matter enormously. 7 were returned after legal demand letters were sent. 3 were returned partially. 9 were never returned. Garrison Price, to his credit, or perhaps in recognition of how badly the ground had shifted, asked for a recess. Judge Okafor denied it. We'll continue, she said. What followed was the arrival of a witness who had not been on the original hearing schedule, a former employee of the Delmore Housing Authority named Carl Whitmore, who had resigned 8 months ago and who Priya had contacted through a legal aid network referral. Carl was 51, heavy-set, and visibly nervous, wearing a blue button-down shirt with a collar that was slightly too tight. He sat in the witness position and kept his hands flat on the table. He had, he said, been a housing intake coordinator for 11 years. He had processed applications, managed the approval pipeline, and for the last 2 years of his employment had received what he described as priority flag notifications, internal memos directing him to hold certain applications and expedite others. The priority flags came from a specific email address within the county administrative system. He had a printout of 17 of those emails. He gave the printout to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. Priya had one more piece of evidence, security footage, not from a dramatic hidden camera, but from the county administrative building's own lobby system, which was public record, showing Margaret Holloway Ashworth entering the Housing Authority offices on 4 separate occasions in the months corresponding to the peak reallocation period, each time without an appointment listed in any public calendar. Judge Okafor reviewed the footage timestamps in silence. She then removed her reading glasses, held them in one hand, and looked at Garrison Price with an expression of complete, composed neutrality that was somehow more frightening than any visible anger. Mr. Price, she said, your client has been escorted from my courtroom, but her interests remain before this proceeding. Do you have anything to submit in response to what has been presented this morning? Price stood. He said with the diminished confidence of a man watching a chess game he thought he'd won suddenly reverse entirely, that the Housing Authority maintained all reallocations were within administrative guidelines and that any appearance of a pattern was coincidental. Judge Okafor let that sit in the room for a moment like something that had been dropped. Then she spoke. And this, This is the part that people who were there still talk about, not just in legal circles, in Delmore County, at dinner tables, in the barber shop on Clement Street. This is the part that someone in the gallery recorded on their phone and which had been viewed, as of that Friday, over 4 million times. "Mr. Price," she began, "I want you to understand what this court has witnessed today. Not an administrative disagreement, not a filing error, not a regulatory misunderstanding. What has been presented before me today is evidence of a systematic, deliberate, and coordinated effort to redirect public housing resources funded by federal grants, by taxpayer money, by the contributions of every working person in this county, away from the people those resources were specifically and legally designated to serve, and toward individuals whose primary qualification appears to have been proximity to political power." She paused. "Your client's wife entered this room this morning and informed a legal aid attorney that she works for her. She said it to a woman who has spent 4 years saving $4,000 to give her children a home. She said it in a room full of people who are paid by this county to uphold the law. And she said it with the confidence of someone who has never once believed the law applied to her. I would like the record to reflect that she was incorrect." She paused again. The courtroom did not breathe. Power is not a roof. It is not insulation. It is not a legal argument. And this court, she said, with a finality that seemed to settle into the walls of the room, is no one's employee. She issued 4 immediate orders. First, a full forensic audit of the Delmore County Housing Authority's reallocation records for the preceding 3 fiscal years, to be conducted by an independent state-appointed oversight body. Second, an emergency freeze on all pending reallocations until the audit was complete. Third, immediate return of all outstanding deposits to the 19 affected applicants, with interest calculated from the date of original reallocation to be completed within 10 business days. Fourth, referral of all documented evidence, the emails, the footage, the pattern analysis, to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential criminal conduct. She looked at Priya Chandrasekhar. "Ms. Chandrasekhar, with respect to your client, Ms. Mendez, the original purchase agreement for 14 Larkspur Lane remains valid under this court's review. The Housing Authority is ordered to honor its terms or demonstrate, in writing, within 15 business days, a legal basis for why it cannot. In the absence of such demonstration, this court will treat the agreement as enforceable." Rosa Mendez, who had sat through 4 hours of proceedings with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed with the discipline of someone who was not going to cry in public, no matter what, put her face into those folded hands when the judge finished speaking. She made no sound, but her shoulders moved. The room around her did. Margaret Holloway Ashworth was in the corridor when the orders were read. She learned about them from her attorney, who came out and told her in a low voice. Witnesses in the hallway described her expression as one of disbelief. Not theatrical disbelief, not performed shock, but genuine structural disbelief. The look of someone whose understanding of how the world works has just been forcibly revised. She left the building without speaking to anyone. The leather handbag swung at her side. The heels of her shoes echoed on the marble floor, and she pushed through the courthouse doors into the gray October afternoon, like a woman walking out of a story she had expected to control. She was not done being in the story. 6 weeks after the hearing, the State Attorney General's office announced it had opened a formal investigation into the Delmore County Housing Authority, naming 3 senior officials and citing the referral from Judge Okafor's court. Mayor Gerald Ashworth, who had spent the days following the hearing issuing careful statements about his confidence in administrative transparency, went quiet. His communications director resigned. 2 members of the Delmore Planning Commission announced they would not seek re-election. Carl Whitmore, the former intake coordinator, cooperated fully with investigators and was granted whistleblower protection status. Rosa Mendez received the keys to 14 Larkspur Lane on a Thursday afternoon in December. Priya Chandrasekhar drove her there. Rosa stood on the front step for a moment with the key in her hand, looking at the door, and then she unlocked it and stepped inside. The house smelled like paint and winter cold and emptiness, the specific emptiness of a place that is about to become something. Her daughter, who was 9, ran immediately to what would be her bedroom and proclaimed it perfect. All 9 outstanding deposits were returned within 8 business days. 2 of the affected families later filed civil suits and settled. The forensic audit found 41 additional questionable reallocations beyond the 19 PREA had documented. A state legislative committee announced it would hold hearings on the oversight of county affordable housing programs across the state. A bill was introduced, informally called the ROSA Act by its sponsors, requiring independent auditing of all affordable housing reallocation decisions. Judge Miriam Okafor, when asked by a local reporter about the case, said only that the law is not a tool of power, it is a constraint upon it. The reporter asked if she had anything to add. She said no. She went back inside. The clip of her courtroom speech was watched by millions of people who had never heard of Delmore County, who knew nothing of Rosa Mendez or Larkspur Lane or the manila folder with the rubber band. They watched it because they recognized something in it, the particular and necessary act of a person in authority deciding, in public, that enough is enough. The rare and extraordinary sight of a system doing exactly what it exists to do, not for the powerful, not for the connected, not for the people with leather handbags and a phone beneath the table, but for the woman in the burgundy blouse who ironed it the night before because she was going to fight for what was hers, and she was going to look like she believed she deserved to win. She did, and she did. If this story moved you, if you believe that dignity should not be a luxury reserved for the powerful, that the law should mean something to everyone equally, then share this story. Send it to someone who needs to believe that justice is still possible. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have said if you'd been in that courtroom? Like this video if you think Judge Okafor deserves every ounce of that applause. Subscribe if you want more stories about the extraordinary moments when power meets its match and discovers, too late, always too late, that it was never as untouchable as it believed. We'll see you in the next one.